On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City's Washington Heights. As he was getting ready to go on stage and deliver a speech, three men forced their way through the crowd, rushed the stage, and shot Malcolm X multiple times. He was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately succumbed to his wounds shortly after. It wasn't exactly a secret why Malcolm X was killed. He was one of the most influential leaders of the civil rights movement, but his vision for the movement was different than that of some of his contemporaries, particularly the peaceful, unifying message of Martin Luther King Jr. Whereas King approached civil rights from an integrationist, nonviolent perspective, Malcolm X approached the movement as a black nationalist with a belief that black people should secure their freedom and equality, quote, by whatever means necessary. Although both men would ultimately be killed because of their views and influence, the circumstances surrounding their deaths could not be more different. Malcolm X's message naturally resonated with many, but it also garnered him plenty of enemies, both black and white. King himself referred to Malcolm X's rhetoric as fiery, demagogic oratory that encouraged people to arm themselves and prepare to engage in violence, language which he felt can reap nothing but grief. Malcolm X publicly made statements that celebrated the deaths of white people and even prayed that God would offer similar blessings in the future. His statements were inflammatory, sure, but to many it felt like a natural response to the decades, centuries really, of violent systemic oppression that Black Americans had faced. His message reflected a profound distrust in a system that had for so long failed to protect people like him, let alone empower them. King felt that if people came together, they could change the system. Malcolm X felt that a revolution was in order, not to change the system, but to dismantle it. To some, this was a terrifying idea, especially when the movement was being led by a black Muslim man. Moreover, his split from the Nation of Islam and subsequent formation of the Organization of Afro-American Unity had turned even his former allies into enemies. Where Malcolm X had once viewed the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, as something of a mentor, Muhammad's extramarital affairs and sharp ideological differences set the stage for a deep rift to form between them, and this persistent tension had deadly consequences. All of this came to a head on that fateful day in February 1965. After the shots were fired, the crowd at the Audubon Ballroom turned on his assailants, relentlessly attacking them until police arrived and took them into custody. 3 men were convicted of the killing, all of them members of the Nation of Islam. Talmadge Hayer, also known as Thomas Hagen, Norman 3X Butler, and Thomas 15X Johnson. However, Hayer always maintained that Butler and Johnson were innocent, and recent updates in the investigation only make it more difficult to answer the question, who really killed Malcolm X? You're listening to History Uncovered, brought to you by the digital publisher All That's Interesting, where we explore the uncharted corners of the natural world and the world past. I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Austin Harvey.
And I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Kalina Fraga.
And today we're looking into the assassination of Malcolm X and who really killed him. We talked about a couple other assassinations. We talked about JFK, I know for sure, in a similar format.
And Andrew Jackson.
And Andrew
Well, he wasn't actually assassinated.
The assassination
attempt.
And Teddy Roosevelt's.
Oh, attempts, yeah.
Yeah, attempted assassinations.
That's right.
I guess JFK is the only other actual, assassination.
I think so. Lincoln, maybe we talked about, but...
Yeah, that was a crossover episode, right? You talked about John Wilkes Booth with Gavin from
that's right.
The Art of Crime.
That was a while ago, though.
Yeah. But this is more similar to that JFK one because there's a little bit of mystery, controversy, sort of. Yeah, very similar situation where it's like they technically got the guy.
Well...
But there's some debate about whether it was just one guy, whether it was multiple people, what the motivation was, whether there were... some sort of hidden machinations behind the scene that came together in this conspiratorial way to take him down.
Right.
So we'll get into that a little bit later. I wanted to just start off going, you and I were sort of just briefly saying right before we started recording, you don't really learn a lot about Malcolm X in school compared to like Martin Luther King Jr., who was obviously another major figure of the civil rights movement, and sort of like, I think, just the one who gets a lot of the credit for it today.
Right. Yeah.
But it's easy to forget Malcolm X was also a very, very big part of it, just in a very different way.
A huge part of it. I have to say, one of the most interesting books I read about the civil rights era in the last couple of years was called The Sword and the Shield. And it's tracking MLK, Malcolm X's kind of like parallel rises. And they start being really far apart on like most things, but they start moving towards each other towards the end of their lives.
That's very interesting.
And they only meet one time ever before.
Yes, which
Malcolm
we do have an entire podcast episode about that. That was before my time.
Oh, did we do a podcast on that? Did I do that? Oops.
You might have.
I think I did. Yeah, it's just interesting because they both had different kinds of influence on the movement, and that book was really great and kind of like laying out both their lives, how they were similar and different, and how their thinking kind of changed. Like MLK became more
radical
in a way, where he was coming out against Vietnam and his war on poverty, and Malcolm was moving more towards like the center and like wanting to work with civil rights like leaders like King versus the Nation of Islam.
Right. And also interesting the way that religion influenced both of their perspectives, because Martin Luther King was a preacher, if I'm remembering properly. He was a preacher. Malcolm X, obviously a major influential figure in the Nation of Islam initially.
Yeah.
And then after, which we'll get into it, but he goes to Mecca at one point and comes back, and that sort of started that radicalization process for him. So yeah, very, very curious, but often an overlooked part of like the American education system. Is like talk a lot about Martin Luther King, the fact that he was killed, the fact that it was like this big peaceful movement, and I said as much a minute ago, but I think the reason it was because he was so much more peace preaching, and the school system maybe doesn't want to touch the more radical aspect of that movement.
Right, which I think is a mistake personally, but
I agree. I fully agree. So I guess we'll ratify that a little bit today. Rectify it. Sorry,
Here we
rectify.
Go. Rectify by radicalizing. Yes.
Yeah. So little background on Malcolm X. He was born on May 19th, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His name was Malcolm Little by birth. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and a huge supporter of the Black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. Given that this was 1920s America in Nebraska, that support sort of put a target on the family's back. Earl Little, by being this vocal activist, sort of inadvertently caused his family to be targeted by white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. They then moved to Milwaukee and later Lansing, Michigan, where their home was reportedly burned down by another white supremacist group, the Black Legion, who I'd actually never heard of the Black Legion before this. And I find it somewhat ironic that they called themselves the Black Legion and they were a white supremacist group.
Yeah, that's true.
It feels like the White Legion might have, not to give the racists ideas, but branding maybe. I don't know, guys. Earl Little then died in 1931 of what they officially deemed to be a streetcar incident. But Malcolm's mother, Louise, thought that it might have been orchestrated by the Black Legion. That sentiment understandably affected Malcolm as he was growing up. Following Earl's death, their family was like plunged into financial instability. His mother suffered a mental health breakdown in 1938 and was committed to the Kalamazoo State Hospital, after which her children were dispersed among foster homes.
He had a lot of siblings too, I think. So
yeah, it was a big
must
family.
have been a lot to take on for her.
That's a lot of tragedy and a fairly influential period of your life, age 6 to 13.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that's going to set the groundwork for someone to be pretty radical, which I think...
Well, to see that the system is stacked against you, yeah.
Yeah, and to be told, like, by your mother that she's pretty sure some racist white people killed your dad.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if they did or didn't, but I wouldn't be surprised.
I think it's unknown, but there is I think there is evidence that that could have happened.
I think it's safe to say that it's at least a non-zero chance.
Yeah.
Right. Despite all of this, Malcolm was an academic success. He excelled academically. He initially wanted to be a lawyer. A teacher discouraged those ambitions. They're not doing their job properly either.
Yeah.
The way what they said was also terrible. They said that law was no realistic goal for the an N word. I won't obviously say it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe not doing a good job there, teach. But that was 1940s America. After he graduated, he eventually moved to Boston, where he lived with his half sister Ella Little Collins, and then later moved to Harlem, where he became involved in illicit activities like drug dealing, gambling, and burglary. So, sort of the exact opposite of the direction he had originally planned.
Mm-hmm.
In 1946, he was arrested for larceny and breaking and entering, resulting in a prison sentence of 8 to 10 years. During his incarceration, he underwent a profound transformation where he basically immersed himself in like literature, philosophy, history, and religion. And between that and correspondence with his siblings, that is what led him to the Nation of Islam. He adopted the NOI's principles, which emphasized Black empowerment and self-reliance, dropped his surname, changed it to X, and this was meant to be a symbolic way of signifying the loss of his ancestral identity due to slavery, which is a very interesting. I never knew why he called himself Malcolm X before doing this research.
Oh, yeah. I think he wasn't the only one who did that during that time.
No,
as well.
We'll mention a couple names later on, but yeah, there was a lot of people who did that. It might have been like the majority of people in the organization. His relationship with the Nation of Islam is very interesting, and also potentially the reason behind why he was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
I think obviously it goes without saying that he became fairly influential as a result of this organization, and that was kind of a twofold thing, just him naturally being very charismatic, and also he was mentored by the leader of the Nation of Islam, who was named Elijah Muhammad. And Malcolm X quickly rose up through it. And then some cracks started to form in their relationship around April 1962. There was a violent confrontation between the LAPD and members of the Nation of Islam, which resulted in the death of somebody named Ronald Stokes. After which Malcolm X was like, pretty quick to advocate for a strong response to that, basically calling for like violence. Elijah Muhammad tempered that a little bit and opted to take a little bit more of a restrained approach to the situation. This made Malcolm X very frustrated, and he basically concluded that like the organization was taking too passive of a stance on injustice. And then he learned about some of Elijah Muhammad's personal conduct. There were allegations levied that he had been engaging in extramarital affairs with young secretaries in the organization, which naturally would go against the moral teachings of Islam and the organization as a whole, or in a larger context. When Malcolm X confronted him about this, he basically confirmed that it was true. He was like, yeah, no, I have been cheating on my wife with secretaries, which I naturally disenfranchised Malcolm X and led to a lot of questions about like whether or not Elijah Muhammad was actually equipped properly from like a moral perspective to be leading the organization.
Right.
Which leads us into a sort of a sort of a weird territory here where Malcolm X was already highly influential, and a lot of people listened to what he had to say. And then he started saying some things that maybe weren't very well thought out or kosher for the culture. After the JFK assassination in 1963, Malcolm X made a remark that it was a case of, quote, chickens coming home to roost, implying that America's history of violence had led to that outcome, which a lot of people did not take kindly to.
Sure, but I mean, there is a history of violence.
I understand the sentiment 100%.
I'm sure it wasn't a very popular thing for him to say.
No,
but I think,
it's just, it's like one of those like pick your battles sort of situations where Kennedy was like a very well-liked guy, and his assassination itself was considered a national tragedy. And so then maybe being like, well, you kind of had it coming. It's like,
I don't know. I feel like it's like this nation has these like horrible sins. So like,
Oh, for sure. No, yeah, like I said, I get where he's coming from. I'm just saying if you're trying to like deliver a message, it's maybe not the best time to deliver that message.
maybe. I don't know. I feel like he was like, people would have seen that. Some people would have seen that as like speaking truth to power, kind of. And
Fair enough. I mean, hey, we're talking about it now,
that's right. Yeah.
60 years later. So I guess fair enough.
That's true. It's stuck. I mean, he also said something, I'm not sure if you have this, what he said about like the march on Washington. I can't find the quote like this quickly, but obviously Martin Luther King was like, I have a dream. That was the whole like speech, and Malcolm X's response to that was like, this is, we're like trapped in the American like nightmare.
Oh, here we go. He said, yes, I was there. I observed that circus. Whoever heard of angry revolutionists all harmonizing, we shall overcome someday, while tripping and swaying along arm in arm with the very people they were supposed to be angrily revolting against. Whoever heard of angry revolutionists swinging their bare feet together with their oppressor in lily pad park pools with gospels and guitars and I have a dream speeches. And the black masses in America were and still are having a nightmare.
That's good. The quote I had, which is kind of the same, I guess, but it's like, while King was having a dream, the rest of us are having a nightmare.
Oh, okay. So sort of, yeah, harkening back. Yeah.
But anyway, he was like, that was a very popular event. I think most Americans, like many white Americans, probably saw with like some hope.
Right.
But Malcolm X saw it as maybe performative and not really doing anything to help.
Yeah. Yeah. That very reflective of like the difference in the philosophy there, where King preached, we should all come together.
Right. And Malcolm was like, maybe we don't.
Yeah. I mean, he's like, maybe that's not possible. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And his philosophy was like, we, like Black people, are being like suppressed. When you're being suppressed, you don't just like lie down and take it, you fight back.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people were like, yeah, that makes sense.
Right. And the Kennedy thing is another example of that, where he was just like, well, I mean, it's kind of what, I don't know what you expected. But like I said, a lot of people were not happy with his comments on that, Muhammad being one of them. He imposed a 90-day public speaking ban on Malcolm X after that statement was made. And then the media attention kind of was buzzing around. And he drew so much media attention with that it was almost like he was like a threat to Elijah Muhammad's influence in the NOI. Because people were paying more attention to what Malcolm X was saying than what Elijah Muhammad was saying.
Right.
Partly maybe because it was so inflammatory, also probably just, again, a testament to his charisma.
Definitely. Yeah, his star was rising, and he was this young, handsome man, and like saying these headline-grabbing things. He was definitely like surpassing Elijah Muhammad.
Right. And yeah, I think a lot of people at the time were like, Elijah who?
Right.
Yeah,
but Malcolm X, they knew.
Right. So this obviously caused a lot of tension in the organization. Then on March 8th, 1964, Malcolm X announced that he would be leaving the Nation of Islam. And he expressed intention to start his own organization. Afterward, he founded the Muslim Mosque, Inc., which focused on traditional Islam. And then he also started the Organization for Afro-American Unity, which emphasized Pan-Africanism and human rights. So sort of two organizations that each specialized in one aspect of what he had already been talking about beforehand. That April, he went to Mecca, undertook a pilgrimage, and he did that experience like basically fundamentally altered him. And when he came back, he was a little bit more, like we were saying, embracing of that sort of inclusive perspective. And through the lens of the teachings of Islam was like, I think we could come together and there could be unity across racial lines. And it was a little bit more tempered in its approach to civil rights after that. But that said, this new message didn't really change anything about his now strained relationship with the Nation of Islam. And that kind of set the stage for a really bad February 1965 for him. On February 14th, 1965, 60 years ago from the day we are recording this.
Oh, so it is.
Because we are recording this on the 14th. His home in Queens was firebombed while he and his family were inside. They managed to escape unharmed, but obviously they were very concerned for their safety afterward.
I think he had like 4 daughters, like young kids at the time too, so.
Yeah, not a great situation.
No, horrible.
Despite the concerns for his safety, though, that incident, you'd think he'd be like, increase security, all these things. But a week later, on February 21st, 1965, he was set to speak at the Audubon Ballroom. And as he was preparing to speak, he was shot multiple times by assailants from the crowd. There were like 400-ish people in attendance when somebody in the crowd shouted the N-word, "Get your hand out of my pocket." Chaos broke out, and then a man rushed forward and shot Malcolm X in the chest with a sawed-off shotgun. Almost immediately after, 2 other people hopped on stage with semi-automatic handguns and shot him as well. He was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. The autopsy revealed that he had 21 gunshot wounds to various parts of his body. Given that there was a crowded theater, they managed to, apprehend people involved pretty much right away. The main assailant here, or the main assassin, was somebody named Talmadge Hayer, also known as Thomas Hagen, who was a member of the Nation of Islam who had previously attended Malcolm X's sermons at Temple 7. They caught him at the scene, and he ended up confessing to his role in the assassination. It took a few days for them to make other arrests, but when they did, it was 2 other members of the Nation of Islam, one man named Norman 3X Butler, or Muhammad Abdul Aziz, and Thomas 15X Johnson, or Khalil Islam. They were also arrested for Malcolm X's assassination. Then it just started this very long legal proceeding. And there were subsequent affidavits in 1977 and 1978, during which Hayer asserted that both Butler and Johnson were innocent. Despite that proclamation, all 3 men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And for a long time, that was where the story ended. And then in recent years, things have changed a little bit. In November 2021, after decades of advocacy and new evidence, Muhammad Abdul Aziz and Khalil Islam were exonerated for their alleged roles in the assassination. And then in 2023, just 2 years ago now, Malcolm X's family announced plans to file a $100 million wrongful death lawsuit against the CIA, the FBI, the NYPD, and other agencies, accusing them of concealing evidence and involvement in the assassination, which is not unexpected. There were almost immediately there was a mix of skepticism and conspiracy theories. Like I said, despite this firebombing incident just a week earlier, a lot of people noted that there was not that much security at the ballroom on the day of the assassination. A man named Earl Grant, who was an associate of Malcolm X's, he said that the officers who were there that day seemed to have a nonchalant attitude. Other people pointed to the FBI's its COINTELPRO program, which was designed to infiltrate and disrupt civil rights organizations. That sort of sparked that initial, was the FBI involved in this? There were allegations suggesting that John Alley, the Nation of Islam's national secretary, was an FBI informant and may have played a role in escalating tensions leading up to the assassination. So not direct involvement, but perhaps putting out the idea that, hey, maybe somebody should kill him.
Yeah.
And then, of course, his departure from the Nation of Islam and his strained relationship with Elijah Muhammad also led some people to speculate that the organization itself had been involved in orchestrating the assassination. So rather than just 1 to 3 individual members acting independently, was it perhaps the Nation of Islam as an organization plotting this? That has been somewhat evidentially supported by statements made by Louis Farrakhan, who was a prominent leader in the NOI. He made some statements that suggested he might have had some knowledge about the organization's role in the killing. There's no confirmation on that, so I'm not going to come down one way or another on it. But it is an interesting thing of note. I think that the wrongful death lawsuit that was filed is very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, what I've kinda heard is, like, I guess the theory is that, like, the FBI, the police maybe weren't involved in the actual, like, assassination, but they knew it was coming and they chose to,
Right.
like,
Let it
stand
happen,
aside.
or
Yeah,
or
exactly.
they were maybe too quick in wrapping up their investigation, where they were like, "Oh, we got the guy. We got him.
Yeah.
Don't
Well,
worry
don't
about it. Nothing else."
right, just let it happen and then don't let there be an investigation, basically,
Right.
because they
Very
wanted
similar to
Malcolm
the
gone and
yeah. Very
yeah.
similar to the Kennedy assassination, where it was like, "Oh, we got Lee Harvey Oswald. We got him." And people were like, "Was it really just the one guy?"
Yeah, or even MLK's. I mean, there's some questions about his, assassin as well,
Right.
whose name I can never remember. I wanna say James Earl Jones. I know that's not his name, but it's something like that. It's one of
James
those,
Earl
like, 3
Jones. Darth Vader? James
It's
Earl
one of
Ray. James Earl Ray.
James Earl Ray. Because he said he didn't do it. He said he was a patsy, basically, like
Right.
Oswald said, and then even King's kids were like, "Yeah, we think there's more to the story here."
Sure, yeah. The interesting thing with the Malcolm X assassination is that Talmadge Talmadge Hayer, did say, "Yeah, I did it."
Mhm.
So there was at least a confession there, and also like again, they caught him at the scene of the crime with a
Yeah.
gun in his hand. So like obviously he was involved,
Right, right, but the question, I guess, is like,
or the
I
other
mean, you kill
guys,
someone in a crowded ballroom, there's gonna be witnesses,
right?
but who ordered this hit? Like, was it the Nation of Islam? Was it Elijah Muhammad and all
Yeah,
these things?
or was he just kind of like independently angry about this and decided to do it? And then if the other two guys are innocent, as he said, and as they've now been exonerated.
Uh-huh.
The reporting said that there were 3 people who rushed the stage and shot him. So if it's not these 2 guys who have been in prison for years at this point, decades, then who was it? Where are they? What happened to them?
Right.
So a lot of unanswered questions still. I think it's really fascinating. And I'll try to not make this a super strong political point. But when Donald Trump recently became president again, he said one of the first things he was going to do was release the JFK files and the
Mhm.
MLK files.
Huh.
I don't know. I haven't followed up with that. I don't know what the outcome of that was.
I haven't heard anything about it yet,
Yeah.
so
But
I
I'd be
don't know.
curious to like, well, if we're going to release a bunch of files, what about the Malcolm X ones?
Yeah, right.
That'd be very curious as well.
That's true.
Assuming there are, I mean, presumably there's
I
files. The
I'm sure
FBI
there are
was, yeah,
files. Oh, I'm positive there are files, yeah, unless they
yeah,
were destroyed or something.
right. And even if they do get released, I mean, how much of it is actually going to be legible and how much is just going to be covered in black ink and
Right.
redacted from the record?
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to get any valuable information out of them as like average citizens, but
It is interesting to think about, like, this assassination, MLK's, even JFK's, just in this era, like, people didn't have cameras or, like, phones or anything, and then I think about that kid who killed the healthcare CEO a couple of weeks
mhm,
ago, and it was like there were cameras everywhere in New York, and they were able to
mhm,
find out where he went, where he was staying, all these things, and, like, in this case, like, they just I mean, maybe there were some cameras that got, I don't know,
right.
conveniently, but it wasn't, like, ubiquitous like it is now. Everyone has a camera in their pocket, their cameras,
Yeah. And
front
even then, it
doors,
took
and
them a minute to find Luigi Mangione,
it
despite
did.
all of that.
Right, yeah, 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 but he wasn't able to completely disappear.
And then when they did, he was in a McDonald's wearing the same clothing with the gun on him still. So that's a little
Yeah, that's on him. He didn't plan that part
that's on
well.
him, I think, at that point. Yeah, it is interesting. When was MLK?
68.
Interesting. Yeah, so that's fascinating. There's 3 like prominent assassinations sort of at each like juncture of the decade. The Kennedy one, the very early part of the 60s, and Malcolm X right in the middle, and MLK at the very end of the
And
1960s.
RFK was killed in 68 as well in June,
Right.
so that was quite a year, 68,
Yeah.
with those
Yeah.
double assassinations and other things, but yeah. Yeah, that was a violent decade,
Yeah, to say the least. But yeah, God, 21 gunshots. 21 gunshot wounds, rather. That's
right, someone
a
really wanted to
lot.
take him down.
That's a lot. Yeah. I find the outburst preceding the rush to the stage very interesting as well.
It sounds like a diversion or maybe someone I don't know, that's kind of a difficult get your hand out of my
Yeah.
pocket.
Right. Yeah. It's like was that said just to cause chaos? Did someone have a sawed-off shotgun in their pocket and then that was grabbed from
I don't
them?
know,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's that also raises a lot of questions. But
yeah, there was a book I read last year that was really a really great book about on Malcolm X and just like his like life and the assassination and everything. It's called The Dead Are Rising. It's by Les Payne, and his daughter finished it. Her name is Tamara Payne after he died. But I thought it was a really fantastic book if people are interested to learn more about Malcolm X, his life, the assassination and everything. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, good to know. I do think I didn't put too much of this in the actual outline for this episode, but I'll touch on it a little bit now. The other than the conspiratorial sort of speculation about who had killed him, I do think the immediate reactions to his death are also worth diving into a little bit. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote to Betty Shabazz, who was Malcolm X's wife, in the wake. He said, "While we did not always see eye to eye on methods to solve the race problem, I always had a deep affection for Malcolm and felt he had a great ability to put his finger on the existence and root of the problem. He was an eloquent spokesman for his point of view, and no one can honestly doubt that Malcolm had a great concern for the problems that we face as a race," which is a very nice sentiment.
Yeah.
Elijah Muhammad, meanwhile, about 5 days later, he was speaking at the Savior's Day convention, during which he said Malcolm X got just what he preached. Then denied any involvement in the murder, saying, "We didn't want to kill Malcolm and didn't try to kill him. We know such ignorant, foolish teachings would bring him to his own end," which is an eerie echoing of the sentiment that Malcolm X himself shared about JFK. The New York Post, the New York Times, let me criticize the proper media institution here. The New York Times wrote that Malcolm X was an extraordinary and twisted man who turned many true gifts to evil purpose.
Wow.
Concluding that his life was, quote, strangely and pitifully wasted. Time magazine called him an unashamed demagogue whose creed was violence. So some harsh words from some pretty big media publications.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I feel like people who supported Malcolm during his life were people who watched, the peace marches and stuff, and then watched these peace protesters getting like beaten by the police.
Yeah, it felt
and when Malcolm
was not effective.
Yeah, Malcolm was like, if someone beats me up, I'm going to fight back. What's wrong with that? And they were like, yeah, what is wrong with that? I don't want to.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I resist that? And I think it's those reactions to his death are like pretty upsetting, actually.
It is upsetting. I think the sentiment regarding Malcolm X has changed a lot since his time on Earth.
I think that's true.
I think over the past 60 years, people have kind of re-examined a lot of what he was saying, especially like given the amount of like police violence against Black people today. I think it was like, maybe he had a point.
Yeah,
because
I think
peaceful protest has not solved the issue.
It's an easy and like nice story to be like, oh, like MLK came and through peace he like solved civil rights.
Right.
And I feel like that's kind of the story that I was told.
It's a nice one to teach kids for sure.
Yeah, as a kid learning about it.
Be like, and if you're not happy with the way the world is, you can just get together and with your friends and yell about how bad it is, and then things will change. And it's like, it's not quite so simple.
Right. Yeah, it's not. And I think Malcolm X is a really important like part of that story.
Yeah. But at the same time, like he was pretty radical about it. And I don't mean that in like I'm not even trying to use radical as like a derogatory term, because that gets thrown around a lot now where it's like, they're so radical. No, I mean, he was radical. He was advocating openly for violence against people. And celebrating the deaths of white people, not just JFK. I think I mentioned it in the intro. There was a plane crash in France, and he said when that plane crashed in France with 130 white people on it, and we learned that 120 of them were from the state of Georgia, the state where my own grandfather was a slave in, well, to me, it couldn't have been anything but an act of God, a blessing from God.
Now, I'm not going to say that like that's like a good thing to say because you don't want to celebrate someone's death. But when he brings in his father being a slave in Georgia, that statement makes sense to me. It's like, okay, like this was a sin of this like state in his words, kind of, and like, you reap what you sow. I think is what he was saying.
That was a lot of his messaging. Was like, wow, white people have been doing bad stuff to Black people for hundreds of years, or so maybe it's divine retribution, maybe you're getting what's coming to them. That said, not every person in Georgia is a bad person who deserves to die in a plane crash.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I think invoking religion in that aspect as well rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, understandably.
Sure.
I think to call anyone's death, other than like Hitler,
yeah,
to call anyone's death like an act of God or a blessing is a little bit like that's radical. That's a radical thing to say. And I'm not. Again, I don't want to be the white guy saying the Malcolm X was wrong. I'm just saying, like, I can understand why that would upset people.
It certainly made him a very polarizing figure during his life and afterwards.
And after, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, when it comes to, like, why do we not learn about him as much? It's like, well, how do you teach? How old are you when you learn about, like, Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time? You're in elementary school for sure.
Elementary school is when I first, like, learned who that was.
So, you know, it's easy to look and be like, oh, there was this man and he said we should all get along.
And then we did.
And then we did. And then you're a kid and you're like, that's great. That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to be like, and then there was at the same time, there was this other man who said a plane crash was a good thing because white people died. And then you're like, well, that seems messed up. And you're like, no, but he did some good things.
But then you're like, well, kids, history is complicated and it's not black and white. And there's a lot of nuance there. And we should explore it more. Let's be curious about it.
Yeah, I think that maybe that's a lesson we save for like middle school or high school.
Sure. I mean, you don't need to get into like the weeds of the civil rights movement in elementary school, but at some point, I think it should be like taught.
I think so too. I do think it's an important. It shouldn't be something that's like relegated to like a college Black history course, which is what it often feels like it is.
Right.
Like it's neglected.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I studied American history in college, and I learned about Malcolm X like on my own after graduating college.
Right. Which is sad.
It is sad.
That is very sad. But it is certainly a much more nuanced adult conversation to have. And even us discussing it right now, I'm like, I got to pick what I say careful.
Sure. I mean, people might come after us, I don't know, for being like too woke or not woke enough or I don't know. But
that's right. That's the other issue. It's like, which is it? Am I too woke or am I not woke enough for my opinions on Malcolm X?
Yeah.
It's not something I want to have to worry about. Like, I think acknowledge the nuance. Be like, yeah, he was a controversial figure.
Yeah, read a book about him.
But an important one as well.
He was. He's a part of the story, so.
Yeah. I think it's not surprising, given historical context and given that Martin Luther King Jr. was also assassinated. I don't think it's surprising that Malcolm X was killed for the things he said and did, given the political environment of the time.
I mean, it's really interesting to compare their assassinations because, like, if James Earl Ray did kill MLK, it was because he was just a racist guy.
Right.
I mean, unless there was a conspiracy, which, like, honestly, like, maybe there was. I don't know.
Right.
And in Malcolm's case...
You would think, because you and I are kind of on the same page here, I think. You would think it's the same situation. Just someone racist didn't like that a black man was saying these things and killed him.
But it's not.
And it's not that. And I find that really interesting. It's like, oh, actually, he wasn't killed because a racist person didn't like what he said. It was other people in the same organization that he used to be a part of. So it's almost more of like a petty squabble.
Right.
About like power and influence in this one organization than it was about the radical things that he was saying.
That's true, I think. But you could argue that he was allowed to be assassinated possibly because, you know, the white powers that be, the CIA or whatever, that was like, well, we don't really need him around. Let's step aside.
I'm just speaking to what we can actually confirm without like any speculative additions to that. It's like he was killed by people from the Nation of Islam, or one person confirmed from it. And that to me is very curious.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about like the other assassinations in that decade, like JFK, like why was JFK killed? Like Oswald, no one really knows what Oswald was thinking because he was killed. You can make some guesses based on his like weird life and living in like Russia and working with like Cubans and the mafia maybe, but I don't know. It's a lot there. We have a whole podcast about that one.
Right.
And RFK was killed by someone who, you know, was very disturbed, but had also, I believe, was Palestinian. And like that was his part of his motivation was that. So I don't know. It's a lot of reasons. But I think it is interesting to compare like these two assassinations in particular.
Right. Because like I said, before I started doing research for this episode, I didn't know too much about the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've mentioned it before, my degree's in screenwriting. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like a studied historian by education there.
Have you seen the Malcolm X movie with Denzel Washington?
I have not. I don't watch a lot of historical biopics, to be fair. I didn't see Lincoln either. So
Oh, I saw Lincoln, but I didn't really like it that much.
yeah. I'm just saying, it's not, I didn't see it because it's just not that kind. I just don't watch that kind of movie in general.
Sure, I thought
it
maybe
wasn't anything specific about Malcolm X.
Come up in your classes maybe because it was like a big deal in like the 90s when it came out. So maybe it would have come across a, I don't know, syllabus or something.
The selection of films my professors chose was weird at times. But no, I did not see the Malcolm X movie. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll put it on the list.
I haven't seen it either. I just know that was like...
Okay, yeah.
That kind of tells his story. And
yeah, but yeah, just to be transparent about my lack of knowledge going into this episode, I didn't know who killed him or why.
Mm-hmm.
And so I assumed, it was probably some like racist guy, like with Martin Luther King Jr. And then I was very surprised to find that it was like kind of more of like a personal dispute situation.
Right. More to the story there for sure.
Yeah. Like of all the things he could have been killed for, it's weird that this was what it ended up being.
Mm-hmm.
There's no larger point to be said about that. It's just an observation.
No, it's interesting. I think the story is interesting and sort of like untold in many ways. And yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other interesting thing is how much of it's sort of still happening. Like how much of this story is still happening between the exonerations and then the lawsuit. So, this is one of those episodes where like we're recording it now. A year from now, there might be something completely new to be said about this.
Right, sure. Yeah, I mean, you could say the same for JFK or MLK.
Yeah.
Like, who knows?
Yeah. So, crazy that history is always happening.
It's always happening. History's alive.
Yeah. Apologies to anyone if I offended anybody with this episode. I tried my best.
No, I think it's good. It's the kind of story that like people should like know and like should be discussed.
Yeah. I mean, especially, again, literally recording this on the 60th anniversary of when this happened. When the episode comes out...
It's a couple days before his... I think it comes out on the 19th.
The 19th when it's out. Yeah. So 2 days before the assassination, or the anniversary of the assassination. I hate that we use the word anniversary for everything, good or bad. Because it inherently always feels like a good thing, because it's like my parents' anniversary. It's like, that's nice.
The anniversary.
The anniversary of an assassination. It's like, there's got to be something else.
Yeah, it's a good point.
It is the right word, but we should make a new one.
Yeah, agreed. A negative.
Yeah.
More than a negative connotation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
hopefully this episode was enlightening.
Yeah, our next episode is also kind of going to deal with some dark parts of American history concerning Black Americans, because we're talking about Thomas Jefferson and his relationship with slavery.
Yeah.
Yep. And there's a lot there, because he wrote a lot and did a lot, and there's a lot to discuss.
Right. When you and I were discussing it the other day, you were like, man, he had some complicated views on slavery, and I don't know how to go about that. And I was like, yeah, it's kind of hard to have a nuanced take on slavery.
I said it's a hard thing to fit into like a script, because there's so much there. I mean, I couldn't fit everything, but there's a lot there.
Right. He certainly did not practice what he preached.
Not really, no. And he did preach a lot of like kind of more liberal, radical for his time stuff.
Right. The things he said, great.
Yeah.
Things he did, not so great.
Not so great. So we'll dig into that in 2 weeks as well.
Yeah. So stay tuned for that one. It's going to be interesting. I won't say it's going to be fun. It'll be interesting.
It's always interesting.
And if you want more stuff that's always interesting, head on over to allthat'sinteresting.com. Where we are constantly publishing news stories about historical events, as well as covering any news that comes up, including, archaeological discoveries, things like that, which we, of course, talk about on our monthly bonus show, but what do we call it? History Happy Hour. Whoa. I was going to call it the after party. And I was like, that's not our podcast. The History Happy Hour, folks. That will be coming out alongside the next episode for members only. If you want to become a member and get access to that show, you can do so at allthat'sinteresting.com/membership. It's just a few dollars a month, and you get some perks like an ad-free reading experience, dark mode on the website, access to History Happy Hour, etc. there. So be sure to check that out. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any of these stories we're publishing, go to allthat'sinteresting.com/sign up, where you can sign up for the newsletter, get those stories delivered directly to your email. Or you can also check us out now on MSN.
That's right. Yeah.
As well as on social media, on TikTok at Real History Uncovered, on Instagram at History Uncovered Podcast, or on YouTube, where we publish the full episodes alongside some video shorts. So
yes. And as always, you can get in touch with us if you'd like to share your thoughts about this episode or other episodes, or ideas for new episodes.
Or offer any corrections.
Sure, thoughts, whatever.
Comments, concerns.
You can email us at podcast@allthat'sinteresting.com, or you can leave us a voicemail at 929-526-3029.
Yeah, would love to hear thoughts about this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would be curious too.
Possibly would love to hear thoughts about this one, depending on the thoughts. No, I mean, I only quickly glossed over Malcolm X's history. So if anyone has like any like interesting tidbits or facts or anything like that, yeah, I would love to hear it. Or if I misspoke and said something out of line, I'm always trying to be a better person. So let me know.
Cool. And we'll be back in a few weeks with Thomas Jefferson, slavery, and History Happy Hour as well.
Yeah, stay tuned.